Well, I guess as I tried to take up writing a couple of years ago, and I think all of us have a book in us, including you, Andrew, and I think sometimes people will try to extricate that from us, and it was my good friend Bill Herrick and my daughter Michelle says, you got all these stories, you ought to write them down.
Vermont's a small state, but when you're crisscrossing it on a bicycle with the goal of visiting each one of the state's 251 towns, the perspective gets a little different. Dave Cannell of Manchester drove his two-wheeler for more than 2,100 miles, uphill and down, and then wrote a book about it. Grandpa's Memoirs, Tour de Vermont 251 was the result, and on Tuesday, May 17th at the Manchester Community Library, he'll join two other local authors, Bill West and Bob Treat, in reading some excerpts from their books and answering questions from the audience. West has written about local hunting camps along Beech Ridge on the north end of town during the 1960s, and Dr. Treat's book chronicles 3 generations of veterinary practice in Manchester. Both West and Treat are first-time authors who joined Cannell in a discussion about their new books at the library.
It started out as I always wanted to put down in print the story of my father's deer camp up on Beech Ridge. And that covers the years from 1961 to 1970. And as I was recalling all those stories and the people that were involved, I realized that very little had ever been written, if anything, about Beech Ridge. And a friend of mine brought to attention this detail of, in one of the very first Manchester Journal editions. I believe the journal was started in 1861 or 1861. This was in 1862 in September, where kids were going to school, I believe, right there right next to
right next to me,
right next to Dave's house, and of course they had to in those days. The teacher had to sort of test the kids to see what level they were at. And this young boy was there, and this is all accounted for in the journal itself. Miss Julia asked this young boy what state he lived in, and he said, "I don't live in no state." And she said, "Where do you live?" And he said, "I live in a shanty on Beech Ridge." Well, that spurred me on to scratch my head and say, 1862, it was called Beech Ridge? And so I said, well, there's got to be a lot of stories going on since 1862. Where did he live? Who his parents were? How did they survive? And so that prompted me to look through the land records of not only Manchester but Dorset and Winhall, which Beech Ridge extends through, and to try to put together this puzzle of the story of Beech Ridge. Unfortunately, there's a big gap between 1862 and 1935, which is the first camp that was up there. Don Dorr's father, Reg Dorr, had a camp there and started in 35. And then there's another camp way up in Brown Meadow, it's called, which could have been before the Dorr camp. I can't verify that. So it went from there, the story of my dad's camp thrown into the history as much as I could dig up about Beech Ridge. And I was sort of surprised that nothing had ever been written about it. So I'm glad that I could save the stories of my dad's camp and also some of the history of the camp and the various people who had camps.
Well, it's about the history of change in the North Shire. It started out a few years ago. The Manchester Historical Society asked me to speak about the changes in veterinary medicine, specifically over the last 3 generations that we've had the practice here. As the evening was over, the members of the Historical Society said, excuse me, you should write this down. Most people don't know what's happened to the changes, and you're not, nobody's going to know it, and it's going to be lost. And I thought, well, they're just being polite, and I don't really know much about writing as far as that goes. So I said, I don't know. It doesn't seem like I really ought to do that. And one of my friends who grew up in grammar school all the way through and then was a client for all these years said, yeah, well, when you die, nobody's going to know about it. And I thought, oh, wow, he's right.
Pressure.
Yeah, so I said, oh, maybe I better reconsider. So I started, and I wrote for about 6 or 8 months, and just on the history of changes I knew about. And I showed it to one of my friends, and they said, well, this is pretty accurate, but it's pretty boring. And so I thought, well, I better change my tactics a little bit. They said, well, write about some cases that you had. Interesting cases, or unusual cases, things that you might stick in your mind and help to emphasize what the changes were. And so then I changed my tactic, and I thought, well, I guess I better do it chronologically. So I started when Dad came, and I started with the reason he came, and that is because of brucellosis and tuberculosis that everybody was getting. This day and age, I don't know, maybe Dave would, but most people don't even know what a hunchback is. And, it's when the tuberculosis organism locates in one of the spines or one of the vertebrae of the chest, and it makes people, have a huge hump in the back. And now it's virtually unknown. But it was pretty common, and I remember quite a few people like that, and they had no treatment for it, no choice. What was actually happening back then, it impacts me more now than it did, with the contrast between what we have now and what we lacked in the 40s, maybe very early 50s. It really impacted me more writing the book and kind of reliving how we lived back then, the pace, to think of no cell phone.
If my body's willing to, in September, I'm going to strap on a pack at the Canadian border, and I'm going to hike the entire length of the Long Trail as a through hiker, not just segmentally where every couple of days I go home and get cleaned up and go from there. I want to do it, from shelter to shelter, come into a community here and there, just like they all come through here. And so that'll have to involve another book. So in other words, these are kind of first-person narrative things, and that's exactly what I intend to do after I start hiking the Long Trail. Just keep some notes and have another book ready for us.
By the head and hold it. And so I started telling that, and I said nose pinchers. I grabbed the cow with the nose pinchers. And somebody said, what's a nose pincher? And I said, oh, wow. Now, how do you explain? And then I got into casting a horse if you're going to do surgery.
Dave Cannell, Bill West, and Bob Treat will be presenting their talk titled Hometown Storytellers at the Manchester Community Library on Tuesday, May 17th, starting at 6:30 p.m. For more information about the talk, call the Manchester Community Library at 362-2607. For the GNet TV News Project, I'm Andrew McKeever.